Okay, Mr. Casa, looks like everybody's up and running, so the meeting is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmer. This calls to order our October Safe Schools Committee meeting. Happy to hit the gavel this time. So you guys know I don't use the gavel all the time, but this time we had to. So we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, with that, we'll go to public comments. I will spare everyone unless there's a hand raised to read the statement. Is there
So far in the attendees is Mr. Resch and Mr. Linsky, who will be in the meeting later.
Hello. And we will move forward then. If no one else has entered, we'll have public comment at the end of the session.
Correct. No hands are up.
Okay. With that, we'll move on to minutes. Approval of minutes. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Are there any comments or questions about the minutes? All right. The motion is approved. Moving to, I see we have no items recommended for work session or action meeting, which means we'll jump right to informational items. Thank you, Mr. Durr and the rest of the administration for the preparation of this information. A very important time for our school district as it is for our county, state, and country. Just want to make sure that these topics the public understands, even though we are reopening schools, we are doing this safely. It does not mean that we are indeed safer just because the schools are opening. It means that we can manage COVID and the pandemic because we're measured and we're following the proper safety protocols. That's a lot of what we're going to review this evening so that the public has a better understanding through this communication and transparency about what it is we as a school district aim to do to ensure as safe and as vibrant a return for students as possible. I can't stress enough that just because the schools are opening does not mean that we should be having birthday parties, soccer games, unmasking. That will help to close the schools as fast as it did before. We must be vigilant and make sure that we keep our positivity rate low. Very confident that if we follow these rules, not just in school, but out of school, we will continue this school year and hopefully continue this path so that we can get 5-day in-school instruction as well. So with that being said, I'd like to move on to those measures which we're taking thanks to this great team that we have here serving the community. Mr. Durr.
Thank you, Mr. Casa. Yeah, some of the items in our informational agenda here this evening are COVID related directly, and some are just safe schools related in general. So we'll move through those. I wanted to give, kind of to kick it off, a little bit of an update on some of the reopening activities that the Office of Emergency Management and Safe Schools has been undertaking over the last couple months in advance of this day where we started bringing students back into school. Utmost importance for us, obviously, it's unusual to have our facilities largely closed for the length of time that we saw here. So in reopening, it was important that we test the systems and the procedures that we use to keep all of our students safe every day on a normal basis, including our fire alarm systems, obviously, which have been not just inspected, but tested throughout the summer here. Our panic systems that we work with Montgomery County on were all tested last week by our security staff throughout the district. Our mass notification system, Alertus, which we use to notify folks within our district when there's an emergency, was tested last week as well. And of course, our surveillance systems, which were all upgraded and updated as part of a district project over the summer, are in the process of being reviewed, tested, and working with our school administrators to make sure all the accesses that were there previously are still in place as we move into in-person instruction. In addition, I spoke about this back in July, if you recall, at committee, but we issued some updated emergency drill guidance to our school leadership, what the expectations are and what the mandates are from the state for emergency drills, including fire and school security drills as we move into in-person instruction. I attached those to the agenda here tonight for your refresher if you'd like to view those. The state also, subsequent to when we talked in July, the state did come out with their own guidance, which matched up with what we had anticipated. So we're all in line there and ready to go. Our school visitor management stations at all of our school buildings, to the extent that we're accepting visitors into any of our buildings, we're all updated, and I actually went out over the past couple of months and worked with our school gatekeeper staff. So that's school office secretaries, school administrators, on modifying any workflows that needed to be changed to account for social distancing and minimizing contact, scanning of driver's license, those types of things. The emphasis on being self-service so that we don't have to bring folks into the office unless it's necessary. So those processes were worked through on sort of a local level at each of our buildings, in addition to the process of confirming everything's working properly and that our folks are trained. Staff, contractor, and student IDs have been either issued or are prepared to be issued to our students, again, in anticipation of whatever the need may be. We had anticipated early on, as part of our food distribution, when we returned in person, that some of our contactless payment would be handled by student IDs. Obviously, we've now found that through the waivers that have been issued by the federal government that we don't actually have to collect payment for student meals, and they'll be free for the foreseeable future here. But if we do come into a situation where we have to be tight with student attendance, we have to account for the movement of kids, for example, at the secondary level in the cafeteria spaces, we can leverage those student IDs to do that and check in and check out. And we're working through the distribution of those IDs to kids. The principals are assisting with that as they deem necessary at their buildings. On the staff side of things, we've asked our staff to be diligent about checking in and out of our buildings. If there's the type of staff that, for example, rotate from one building assignment to another. Obviously, if contact tracing becomes necessary, it becomes very important for us to be able to account for who was in the building at any given time. So our updated staff IDs and that process make that a lot easier than perhaps it was in the past. And then finally, just last week on Tuesday, I met virtually with our local law enforcement leaders, our emergency managers, and our fire code officials, just to update them and make sure they're up to speed with our reopening plans. Things that they handle for us kind of in the background that are very important are obviously crossing guard assignments out in the community, our school zone signals, and of course, if there is an emergency, any response to our buildings and how those are handled. It was a good conversation. They're on top of things. I will say they're always perplexed by our scheduling, but they're not in the educational world, so they're in the police world. But they're all up to speed, and we saw today that they were out in force. I was actually over at Culp this morning and was joined by one of the Hatfield police officers over there who was just making sure everything was going well. So that's some of the things we've been going about here in the last several weeks. Any comments or questions on those items?
Mr. Durr, I have one question.
Sure.
So in regards to student IDs, I haven't heard anything yet from at least high school administrators as to what that would look like if they're going forward with distribution. So would you have any information as to what administrators at the secondary and maybe even possibly the elementary levels, what they are planning to do to get that distributed?
So the actual distribution will be kind of customized by the principal. So at the high school level, Mr. Nicholson will come up with, and the assistant principals will come up with exactly what that looks like. And I don't want to assume, but I would imagine as students come back in person, whether you're a hybrid 1 or a hybrid 2 student, there will be a method devised to get your ID out to you. If you're a new student or you've joined us since we last took student photos, there'll be a process for you to come in, have your photo taken by our front office staff, and have an ID printed right at the school. One of the good things, and it's an improvement, I believe, over the past process is we can now do that all right in the security office. We can generate student IDs in real time, as opposed to, waiting for the school photographer, which is what what we had to do in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee?
Mr. Durr, one
Um,
quick thing that you didn't mention was the great effort of our emergency personnel, North Penn Television, and yourself in arranging a virtual live training for all elementary school students on fire safety. So I believe we had new technology, drones, multiple municipalities streamed to over 6,000 kids at the same time, which is
Wow.
pretty neat. So kudos to you for that.
That's remarkable. Thank you, Mr. Durr. Was there another question?
Mr. Casa, I just wanted to thank Mr. Durr for his work and the entire administration, because I heard really great things about today and the preparation and how inclusive it was and how thorough it was by including the community, the fire folks, the police and such. And I did hear about the video. I didn't see it, but I heard through a friend, and I heard it was amazing. So thank you.
So then my question to follow up, and thank you to Mr. Durr and your staff. So if that video was for the elementary students, will it also be shown to the upper grades?
So you're seeing a little bit of that now on the screen in the Zoom meeting. Yeah, this was a first, at least for me. And just to recap a little bit, or to back up a little bit, typically our volunteer firefighters would come into our elementary schools, do an in-person presentation to students for fire prevention week. Obviously, that wasn't possible this year, so we put together, with the help of North Penn Television and all of our elementary school administrators and our leadership here in the fire service, this live to the classroom fire prevention demonstration. And it's on YouTube. We don't typically have any targeted efforts in the fire safety lane to secondary, but this for sure is available for viewing. I mean, the content here was geared towards elementary students, as it typically would be.
Okay.
This is great, and wonderful use of technology and continuing to innovate during pandemic, how we're going to get that message to our kids and keep them safe. I'd also like to commend you, Mr. Durr. We've covered this in the committee over the past year, at least the last half year. I'm very happy to see the detailed evacuation drills and the lockdown drills, especially that we have this hold, and we're going to practice that in December across the district. I think it's really important because it gets us away from just the anxiety-driven active shooter drills, and it's more about, having a multi-pronged approach. So thank you for that. And I also think having that added as a hold option is going to be very beneficial to our students, because they're going to know if something's going on and someone needs medical assistance, this isn't an active shooter, or this isn't something life-threatening. People just need to get into the building. And it's that type of evolution through this program that I've been very pleased to see.
Yeah, we added that hold procedure in the fall last year in 2019, and it was used on several occasions with great success. So you're absolutely right. It's a great low-level lockdown that does not bring the anxiety that a true lockdown, emergency lockdown does.
Thank you for advancing that all hazards type of approach. Very strategic.
I just wanted to quick add on to that a little bit. I was in the building when that first hold drill did happen, and I think the only suggestion, or the only kind of confusion I had with it, is no one really knew what the hold was at the time that it happened, which I am going to assume was intentional. But again, like you said, that low anxiety was there. Everyone kind of understood that it wasn't a severe issue. So on top of that, on that aspect, I definitely do agree, but I just wanted to bring that up.
Thanks for that feedback. I've heard that as well from some other students, and that's just how we continuously improve. So thank you for that feedback. If there aren't any other questions or comments, we can move on to the next item.
Mr. Casa, I have one more question, just a general one if I could, or you prefer me to hold it?
Oh, please go ahead.
Mr. Durr, is the frequency of the interaction with other school districts at the same level as it was prior to some of the districts going back hybrid or virtual, or has that really diminished the number of calls? Because I remember hearing it was all day, every day for a number of months.
You're referring to the number of interactions between like myself and my counterparts in other school districts, or?
Right. To identify best practices, some of the processes you put in place, some of the readiness actions you put into place, is that going to continue, or you feel that, North Penn District School District is in good shape where it is, or is there a predetermined, okay, we've agreed to continue to meet on a 2-week frequency, a monthly frequency? Just wanted to know.
It's a good question. So informally, I'll say that I'm in contact with some of the folks, my counterparts in other Montgomery County school districts quite often, just to bounce ideas back and forth, as I think, anybody is. Formally, pre-COVID, we had begun meeting in person with the IU group of safety and security directors on a monthly basis. Well, when we closed in the spring, that did stop. We had a couple spot meetings here and there, but then we just did resume at the beginning of October, virtually meeting. So to answer your question, we'll be meeting on a monthly basis now, and the IU does a really good job of facilitating that discussion and populating the agenda with some really relevant items to make sure everybody's talking about the same things. Some of it are things that we know already, like the drill guidance, and then some of it are things that other folks are seeing in their districts that can inform how we're moving forward here for sure. So a monthly basis virtually is what we're seeing now.
Thank you for that update. There's so many things that goes on for safe schools that admittedly, we sometimes lose the simple things that are being done, which are also the most important. So thank you. Let's move on to the next item, please.
Certainly. So this is not necessarily a COVID related item, but grievance procedures. And we've talked about this before here at committee and how grievance procedures tie into our security workforce and making sure that we're, the integrity of our department and our workforce is upheld, and that anything that we need to know about is brought to our attention. So in talking through this with Dr. Bauer and the committee here in the past, this kind of rides the line between two different worlds. And I've attached them here into the agenda. One is the harassment policy that was passed by the board in December of last year, which is very comprehensive and outlines in detail how any complaints of harassment are dealt with in the district. But perhaps, things that we want to address are not necessarily defined as harassment, right? So there needs to be a little more of a local level or a departmental level policy or procedure for handling complaints. And I've also attached that, and what you see there is a excerpt from the handbook that we've put together for our security department, which pulls from the board policy, but I think goes a little bit further. And the highlights that I want to pull out here are, one, when we're receiving complaints, I think it's important that we acknowledge an anonymous method of receiving complaints as well. I think that's important. And obviously, Safe to Say Something is our go-to anonymous reporting system. And there is a harassment category within Safe to Say Something. The other part that I want to point out here is at the very end of the procedure there for personnel complaints is that both parties, both the complainant and the accused, will be informed of the outcome. And I think it's important to acknowledge that wraparound to anybody, unless of course they're anonymous, but anybody who shares with us a grievance against a staff member, I think deserves to know the outcome of that investigation. And that closing the loop, so to speak, is very important. So that's built in. That's also built into the harassment policy to a certain extent. But I wanted to acknowledge that within our departmental procedure. And this is shared up front with our security officers, so they know what the expectation is. And they also know their role if they receive or become aware of a complaint against a fellow security officer. The next steps here, I believe, are just pushing this out again, messaging to staff, to students, putting this out there so particularly students know that they have an avenue to share anything that they've experienced that they feel is either unprofessional or worse from any of our staff members, but certainly in my purview from our security officers. So policy coupled with departmental procedure here, I think, gets us a long way towards the goal of a grievance procedure. And I welcome your thoughts on this, certainly, Mr. Casa.
I appreciate as well our adherence to Title IX with complainant and respondent balance, moving forward. So that's good to know that we're covered. And, I'm confident we probably always were. I'm interested in hearing, I'm happy to hear about the promotion efforts. I think that's the key. The district has always had some of these guidelines and regulations in place, I'm sure. But as we evolve, the goal is, how can we promote so that the student body, so that others are aware of, say, these 4 type of options. We've had that discussion that, at least 20th century model, it's report to your principal, report to your, everything can report to the principal. But we're trying to make sure that we expand those options to communicate and yet still be able to collect that information, and that therefore we can act upon it. And that actually helps create a better culture of safety, because there's going to be confidence in the school district's ability to be responsive. So I like seeing these initial steps. I don't need to hear today exactly what it is we're going to do to make this actionable, but I'm very interested in hearing, how do we make this digestible on a daily basis, right? It's one thing to train it, and then it's another thing to hold ourselves accountable to the standard. Are there any thoughts about how we might go forward, getting this off of paper and into operations? Understanding you don't have to have a perfect answer right now. Yeah, generally speaking.
Oh, for me? I thought you were asking the other committee members.
Anybody.
My apologies. So it's tough, and you're absolutely right. And that's when, navigating this and thinking, do we need additional policy from the board level or administrative regulation? I really think those things are important to back up, whatever it is we're doing. But as you mentioned, the key is getting it out there. And it's a challenge, especially now when we're trying to get so much out there. So, and you can chime in, Dr. Bauer, but sure. I think there's ways we get it in front of the eyes of kids, and it falls right in line with our continued promotion of Safe to Say and what we need to hear about, and that there are ways that we can, help, and you're not alone. All of those messages that we continue to push, this becomes a thread in that messaging, in my view. And
yeah, so I was going to describe the processes that we use for professional development for administrators as well, because they would be the most likely individuals I would expect in a circumstance where security is involved and there's concern. The administrator's usually there as well. So when we have changes to policies or even just rules or regulations, we'll have a training typically with the school district solicitor in our district admin meetings. So Mr. Durr could provide an update to district admin one of our monthly meetings, explaining this procedure. I have not reviewed this document that is given to security officers. So I think, like you said, getting it out there, I think that's one great vehicle is our district admin. And then other target audiences, I'm thinking guidance counselors, some of our other counselors, like our SAP counselors, our Marikey, some of our contracted services. But those are the folks that students would typically confide in. And I think them being knowledgeable of this process would be helpful.
I like what I'm hearing. From my professional background, not micromanaging here, but that's, in higher ed, it's campus security authorities, that people are aware if certain types of reports come to them. Of course, we're used to that with Childline and other areas. But for what the vision of this committee is, right, to ensure that we're as inclusive as possible as a district and we live up to those standards and values, we need to make sure that we hear if certain student groups, any student group, but in particular those that are underrepresented or marginalized, have that confidence and understand what they need to do to make those reports. And therefore, if we're getting that information, the administration can see if there are patterns or not. And then we can address it accordingly. So I'm happy to hear that. My last statement on this, just because it's dear to my heart that we advance these things, and perhaps this is for legal counsel, but I would consider as well, from my higher education experience, having a confidential aspect to this, as well as anonymous and confidential within reason, because there are obviously certain standards we can't remain confidential. But in regards to having this feedback loop about our safe schools services and security, people should know that they could be anonymous, as well as have certain confidential reporting opportunities with reasonable limitations. So thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Cass, I
No,
didn't mean
please
to
go ahead.
interrupt. So yeah, there's a few things I just wanted to add. If in the case of getting some of this information out to students, particularly high school students, I've seemed to find that email, like those mass email blasts that come out on various academic policies, et cetera, that is a very effective way of communication. As well as possibly doing something on the North Bend High School newspaper, et cetera, things like that. Another thing I've also found really helpful is also spreading a lot of this information to clubs. One of my clubs is actually getting some information from the North Bend High School library and distributing that to our members. So as a way of kind of showing what's kind of going on up at the higher levels of North Penn School District. And I also did really like the confidential aspect, Mr. Casa, that you mentioned. I think that will definitely help students, especially open up when they are scared and they are vulnerable, and giving them a little extra security as to what could possibly happen if they were to come out about something.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for those insights. Dr. Lewis Campbell or Ms. Wesley? None? Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll
okay,
echo
Kathy.
what, I'm sorry. I'll echo the confidence, and I wasn't going to mention it, but since Ahana did mention it, I think confidentiality is important, and to identify those limits. So if a policy was discussed, I think if there was a framework determined about the level of confidentiality and what can be disclosed would be really important, because I know from my world, corporate world, dealing with harassment, again, not with students and people that feel they're at risk or marginalized, that was probably one of the overlying far-reaching issues that we always had to be very respectful of and sensitive to, Mr. Casa.
Thank you, Ms. Wesley. Any further comments or questions on this topic?
I'm glad to see the confidentiality aspect included as well. The last thing we want to see is that there can be retaliation against someone who comes forth with a complaint. So I think that's in order, and I'm happy to see it.
Thank you. Well, the one thing at Safe Schools is that whenever we come up with these ideas, we know that we're just creating work for Vice President Fusco and the rest of the policy committee. But I'm very happy with this conversation and the various points of input, so we can help inform the policy development if that is indeed needed to advance this further. And okay, let's move to the next topic, Mr. Durr.
All right. All right, a snapshot on some of the professional development activities, again, for our security staff members. And the document attached to the agenda here this evening kind of spans 2019, late 2019 into the future. And I'll run through this briefly. Much of it I've talked about previously at committee, so it'll be some familiar terms you'll hear tonight. First and foremost, that required training that was given to us by the state for the basic school resource officer training, as previously reported, that's been completed by all of our permanent staff members as of February 2020. That's a full 40-hour week-long in-person course that's taught by the National Association of School Resource Officers, and they've actually subsequently approved an additional vendor to provide that training as it becomes necessary for us in the future. So all of our folks have had that training, and you can see some of the bullets there, the key topics that they speak about in that course, but it is actually very comprehensive when it comes to a lot of the key buzzwords that we hear about in school, trauma, school law, diversity. They're all threads within this NASRO course. Also completed before we shut down last spring was an annual training that we do with our security officers from Devereaux. The Safe and Positive Approaches training, SPA training, which equips them to assist our school staff and our school administrators with kids in crisis. Again, emphasis on prevention, diffusion, but if necessary, personal interventions, personal emergency interventions, or those PEIs, if they have to go hands-on to restrain a student for their own safety or the safety of others. And folks that are certifying in this SPA training actually have to physically demonstrate those skills on the annual basis. So to ensure that they're competent, in addition to our security officers, many of our school administrators, our behavior analysts, and others are trained as well. As we closed down in March last year, we shifted to an online mode of training, and much of the spring for our security staff was taken up by some self-directed learning. And when I say that there was just a mixed potpourri bag of topics that they completed, it was all content that came from either FEMA, from the Emergency Management Institute online, Safe Schools, which is our online training provider from our Human Resources Department. And we required our security officers to complete a certain number of those per week to provide certificates and a log of their activities as they move through that self-directed training. In addition, they had a number of topics that were assigned by me, week-long topics that we ended with a virtual conversation or a department meeting each week. And you can see some of those listed there. From TEACS, we did a risk management for before and after school times. We had a lot of good discussion within the department about some improvements that our security staff see in their eyes on a daily basis that we can do a better job of either before school or maybe after school during activities or non-structured times. We talked about, we did some reading and some research on school to prison pipeline and restorative justice. Interestingly, the diverse group of folks we have in our security department, some of them do have experience in the corrections world, and some do have experience in the restorative justice world or the restorative world. So we had a real good conversation about that, in addition to prepping them for what you'll see a little further down the page, which is some formalized instruction from our staff here, who are now have the ability to teach some of the strategies from IIRP, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we also did a little bit, of course, on active shooter awareness and response, working with our law enforcement folks, communication in a crisis, and a real good discussion we had at the end of that week on the presence of weapons, like armed security in the building and the different viewpoints on that. It's just real interesting and a real good spirited discussion that evolved as we talked through those things. So that's what occupied that time in the spring where we were closed and security officers were not working in our schools on a daily basis. Just this week, I should say this past Friday, we kicked off the North Penn version of the cultural proficiency curriculum that I have to give a huge shout out and kudos to Dr. Waters, Jackie Giamarco, Meg Burke, Mike Bodai, who are hugely busy right now and were able to indulge me with spinning this curriculum into a digestible format for our security officers. We kicked that off on Friday. They're completing some self-paced modules through Canvas right now. We're going to meet again this Friday to introduce the next several modules, and then we'll close out the beginning parts of that discussion on the 6th of November with a meeting. And if you know any of those names that I just mentioned, or you've heard from them, you know that they're passionate about the work and they're just incredible. And they can even get our very quiet security officers to share things and sometimes and to give their input. So I'm really happy about that. And then to just continue in that thread, Safer Schools Together is a great group out of Canada that does a lot of work with social media, current trends, and they have an online course on the 18th, which we're going to assign several of our security officers to. COPS, and I'll give Mr. Casa the kudos for drawing this to my attention. We've talked about this in the past, but the Office for Community Oriented Policing Services, which is a huge provider of training for law enforcement, has released this P5 curriculum, which is a 60-minute online module, which has many of those same topics included in it, and is going to be a great source of content that our security officers, again, can complete at their own pace on the times that they have available. And it doesn't take away from the workforce to put them in a class, and that we have to either wait for an opportunity or replace them during the day. So that's going to be a great opportunity as well. COPS also offers that P5 course in an in-person format, which I think down the road, as we look at ways to keep the conversation moving into the future, that may be a strategy once some of our in-person opportunities kind of shake loose again post-pandemic. But COPS is a new content provider for our security folks, which is going to be excellent. Just a formality, in the spring, we'll do our CPR first aid renewal for everybody in the department. We have 2 early dismissal days in March where we'll do those refreshers. And then, as I mentioned, working to put together some level of restorative practices awareness as we begin to incorporate those things at the secondary level, particularly the middle schools. I think it's really important that we keep our security officers on the same page, what the strategies are, so that they can support as needed. So some level of training from our own certified trainers within the district, hopefully in May, if everything lines up. And then as we go forward, continuing to keep our security staff in the same lane as the rest of the district as we push ourselves forward with diversity, cultural proficiency, restorative practices, obviously all the mandated trainings that we have to do as far as CPR, first aid, those types of things. Comments, questions?
Does the committee have any comments, insights, questions?
Yes, Mr. Costa. Mr. Dorr, regarding restorative justice, I know just a tad about it, not much, but with the principles of that in place, do you have any thoughts on how the principles of that could be, I guess, implemented into the district, whether, regardless of the level of elementary, middle, or high school? Because I mean, I've only read that it has proven to be very effective in mending issues between community groups and circles within a community, and just I think it's a great principle, and I'm just I personally would like to see it explored more, unless you've already identified where you'd like to put it into practice.
Yeah, I also have some professional development to do on restorative practices, and I'll let Dr. Bauer chime in, but we identified, again, pre-COVID, a cohort of folks to go up to the International Institute of Restorative Practices and actually become certified as trainers, so that we can begin to roll that training out on a wider basis within the district. And from my seat, without knowing, again, like you mentioned, the details and the granularity of restorative practices, it obviously makes sense. It's obviously consistent with what we want to see within education. And I think the stories of its success are many. And the rollout itself, I just, from my seat, want to make sure our security officers are there for the ride. So whatever training is taking place as we begin to expand it out, I want to make sure our security staff, since they're dealing with kids on a daily basis, we want to be supporting those principles as much as possible.
Yeah, and Mr. Durr, I'd like the way you describe that. It puts in balance what we're doing at the building level with PBIS as well. And right now that's with educators and with children and how we're changing the climate. But what I like with the type of training strategy that we have, and these are very good trainings too, That we're dealing with managing implicit biases, responding to youth behavior and de-escalation, and coming from an approach with our security team of a youth development lens. And that's going to have dividends in that return on investment in time. And to the point that what I'd like to say when I mentioned that PBIS side of the coin, as our security team gets this training, where we're really headed to, and I think what could be a very good indicator that we've elevated ourselves to yet another higher standard, is it's one thing for us to train our security in everything they need to do to advance our goals. It's another thing to make sure that our building administrators and our administration understands how security is to fit in within the vision of North Penn School District, right? And this goes back to, I know when I first came on the board, we don't want to have building bouncers. We want to have a collaborative, inclusive approach in which the team in the building knows how to effectively use security as part of a wider vision and mission. And I have to commend you for advancing this as far as you have now with some really good programs, and excited to see where this goes in the months and years ahead.
Can I say that
Mr. Dorr, I have a
I concur. I'm impressed, Mr. Dorr. This sounds remarkable. A lot of times those people at that level don't get this type of training. And to see that this school district is interested in having our security top-notch, buttoned up, this is great. Can you refresh my memory? What's the security count at the schools, elementary, middle school, and high school?
Personnel-wise, numbers.
Yes.
So we have at our high school, we have 8 full-time security officers, which are spread over a large time frame. So 5:30 a.m. well into the evening hours to account for typically, I'll put that in quotes, typically, to account for after-school activities, sporting events, those types of things.
Okay.
Our middle schools have either 1 full-time and 1 part-time security officer, or 3 part-time security officers in the case of Penndale, just due to the population difference. Again, to cover the school day and into the after-school hours if there are activities. And then we have a security officer, whose assignment is to be a balance of the district person for the elementary level. So he is out on a daily basis, circulating through the elementary schools, handling anything that comes up, anything from traffic to disgruntled person to, abandoned vehicle, to animal complaint. So he's out fielding those calls at the elementary level on a daily basis. And then we have at Northbridge School, we have a security officer over there to assist as well. The total count in the department is 18.
18?
Correct.
Thank you.
Good recall. For sake of time, Ms. Wesley, then if Sahana, if you have any questions or insights, and then we could finish with Dr. Bauer, and we'll move on to the next informational item.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Mr. Dorr, this is just for me to understand. So when you speak of restorative practices, that's the next, level down and implementation of restorative justice. Is that correct?
My understanding is the terms are somewhat interchangeable.
Right. So speaking specifically of restorative justice speaks to the premise of repairing the harm, right? When something goes wrong, when a student gets in trouble, where an altercation takes place, it's rooted in the theory of we need to let students know who they've harmed, what they've harmed, and how do we repair that and correct it. Restorative practices, which I think the name is a bit misleading at times, is rooted in proactive measures of building relationships, getting to know one another better, and building connections within our schools to prevent. So when you say restorative practices, I think that the nature of the word restore makes you think that you have to fix something that went poorly, but it really is. They say something like 75% of it is proactive. So Ms. Wesley, I think you asked a question at the beginning of this about ways in which we'll make this happen. And we actually took restorative practices into consideration when we were reworking our bell schedule. So we want to have time in place in the schedule in our middle schools to implement some circles and some discussions on a daily basis to build those relationships. Now, one of the minor speed bumps that certainly we will overcome was that, as Mr. Durr alluded to, we utilize Safe Schools grant monies to get folks trained to actually train the trainer. And Mr. Casa also mentioned having our administration involved. Several of our building principals at the middle level are the trainers, which is great. So we're leading from the top there. That said, they were not trained to train virtually. So they were not permitted to. We were hoping to train folks over the summer and begin to roll this out. And in the virtual environment, we were unable to do so because we weren't credentialed or authorized to. So that does not mean we can't use components of the theory behind restorative practices in our schools immediately, because much of it is just good teaching and good, if we can use the word, good adulting in a school environment. So very excited about where this can go as we start to train folks in person throughout this year, and our security staff as well. So kudos to Mr. Durr. He kind of fronted the grant effort and certainly getting our security staff trained as well.
And thank you, Dr. Bauer, for your background and expertise as well. I would add to this, right, we can blame COVID for a lot of things, but in February, Vice President Fusco and myself had met with someone from the Public Defender's Office, and we were going to be doing some tours of youth courts, because when we heard about the outcomes that they've been having at some other Montgomery County districts. So that's something as well, just, for the committee and for those who might be listening, that we've heard a lot of things in the last 15 minutes that are being done to further these goals. And it's very real. We don't know how it will add up in the end, but we know it will result in more engagement and less enforcement. That's what we're trying to get to. And go ahead, Dr.
Well, and also what it does, it's using it to have a teachable moment instead of always punishing the student and having those punitive measures of discipline. It shows them another way, and it helps them to see the error of their ways, pretty much like what Dr. Bauer said. So I think it will be great to have that in our school district. And do you know if other districts are doing this, or are we the first, or are there others that have already instituted this restorative justice practice?
I can't list schools that I believe do it with fidelity. I'm sure there are hundreds around the country that use restorative practices.
No, I mean in our district.
Oh, okay. No, I don't believe we have anyone else. Northbridge utilized it, I'd say 5 years ago, that the whole staff got trained, and they found great success. I mean, I think cut their suspensions down 90%, something, maybe even more. So we explored the idea of doing this larger scale across middle schools initially. And then hopefully we eventually get to the high school. So we do also have a youth court that we implemented, I'm going to say 3 years ago now. And it has not quite gained the momentum I would have hoped, but we do have students who are trained, and we do have a youth court. So we've had some success, but it's limited. It's smaller scale.
Perhaps they can give a
Great.
at some point in the new year.
Benchmark eventually.
Sahana, do you have any questions or insights?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I wanted to comment on. So one thing, again, that I've seen very helpful, not just with security guards or with staff or with teachers, administrators, again, is just keeping a good connection between the student and the teacher, administrator, etc. I think that always helps, not just in a sense to prevent actions that should not happen in a school context, but also just helps to foster a good connection. So I did like that was emphasized, and I've seen students have good relationships with security guards at the high school and also just teachers in general. So I did like that a lot. And oh, sorry, I blanked for a second, but the other idea of proactive measures to limit disciplinary action, again, I've said this before, I think that helps to educate the students as to what their actions could result in, and helps them to give them kind of like another view as to, oh, like I should not do this. I should approach this situation in a different manner. So again, I also do really like that idea of proactive measures to kind of take a different path almost, rather than just disciplinary action.
Thank you. And we'll move on now to the health and safety plan and student instruction. And the way this is structured, I know we're coming up at 7, but some of this is a bit more brief because it's an overview. This dovetails with other committees and work that's being done. But as it relates to safe schools, important that we touch upon this so the public is aware.
Yep. So our next item is our health and safety plan as we return to learn, and some of the implicit instruction that's required for students, which is very much, I believe, still a work in progress as we bring students back. I'll let Dr. Bauer touch on some of the things we've done and maybe some of the plans as we move forward.
Yes. So certainly, as Mr. Casa led off at the top of the hour, keeping our folks in our schools, students, staff, everyone included, safe is the priority. And so we have a couple examples, and I know we are pressed for time, but I think Mr. Gilmer's prepared. We have a 1 minute. Here's an example of how we are explicitly instructing students and families how to ride the bus safely, for example. And then we have another one that we shared with all of staff. So while we want our building leaders to provide the professional development on our health and safety plan, we also want a consistent message across the entire district. So the first video is...
As the North Penn School District
That went to 2013.
So give me a second. Sorry about that.
No problem. We could, I was going to say, if you want to try the other video in the meantime, just for 30 seconds to buy you some time to work behind the scenes. But the other video you'll see is a very simple, but very direct and explicit instruction on our health and safety protocols.
Outlines the health and safety protocols for a return to school and school reopening in the North Penn School District. The guidance contained reflects the most current information as of October 13th, 2020. As everyone is aware, the pandemic COVID-19 is a rapidly evolving situation. There may be times when the North Penn School District will need to alter these protocols. We follow the most up-to-date guidance from the Montgomery County Office of Public.
Okay, so while that's Dr. Rufo narrating, and it is a 31-minute video outlining all the protocols from the health and safety plan to all staff, and all staff had to complete a form at the conclusion of the video so that we have record that everyone engaged in the training, everyone's hearing the same message. We also have
2 of the following symptoms. You may have COVID-19.
Everyone has too much going on in 2020, right? So additionally, coming up, and you'll see the bus safety video in a moment, but we are also working on a video to provide to all students, differentiated for the secondary and elementary levels. So working with our communications department and Mary Fakish and some of our administrators to kind of break down the health and safety plan for students. So one is secondary centric, one is elementary centric. And we want the consistent messages. We don't want lunch to be instructed differently at Oak Park as it is at Culp. So same message going to all students and all families. And an example would be the bus video. And here we go.
School District prepares to return to learn, there are many new safety measures in place across the district to keep everyone safe and healthy. For those students who will be riding our school buses this fall, here are some important things to know as you return to school. When waiting at the bus stop, please wear a face covering and practice social distancing as much as possible. When entering the bus, please be sure your face mask is on and proceed to your assigned seat. Families will be seated together and all buses will load back to front to avoid students passing each other upon being seated. All bus drivers will be wearing a face mask, and each student is also required to wear a mask while riding the bus and at school. When possible, buses will have increased ventilation by opening windows and roof hatches in favorable weather conditions. When the bus arrives at school, students will exit the bus front to back to reduce any possible exposure. As you exit the bus, please follow the staff's instructions for entering your school building in a safe manner. These simple steps will assist the North Penn School District in keeping our students and staff as safe and healthy as possible as we return to learn to our classrooms together.
So while simple, that is a video that went out to all families on, I believe, Sunday evening in preparation for our return to school for K-2 today. So just an example of how we will explicitly provide some PD to our students to prepare them for this return to school.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer. For the sake of time, we'll move on to the COVID-19.
One thing I just want to add super quick. I just want to say that with in terms of communicating information about the return to learn or various policies, I don't know about that specific bus video if that was targeted only to K through second grade students. Am I correct with that?
Yes, that was the primary focus for that video because they started back today. So the additional video will come out prior to November 9th for the remainder of our students.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure this is how it will be communicated. Email, I always find it to be the most effective way of communication, especially in a virtual environment. And I have to say, I did enjoy the video.
Yeah, there's something about seeing 5- and 6-year-olds that just makes everyone smile. I was noticing our board members on screen smile when they saw the kids. So.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Sahana. Okay, on to the next topic, please.
Data dashboard.
So in terms of a data dashboard, this is something very exciting. And Mr. Gilmer, if you could cue that up for me. This is something that was prepared by our data analyst in conversations and collaboration with Mr. Casa and our communications department, our HR department, and actually our pandemic liaisons, which Dr. Dietrich will speak to in a moment. But while you're seeing here that the numbers are 0, if we scroll down a bit, we'll be able to see student and staff cases disaggregated by school. You'll be able to click on a school and see how many cases, active positive cases are in the school for students and staff. So just another measure that we're taking to be transparent with our public. And once students are back in school, to be able to see how many cases there are, because of course rumors spread, and if you don't tell your story, someone else will. So this is a way that we are telling our story and sharing it with the public.
And the good news is right now we have 0 cases. So that's something to celebrate.
And once again, this is going to help reinforce, right, the data with the transparency and the communication. And for the public, as we started off this meeting, and I'll probably be saying when we gavel in a version of this for facilities and operations, which, by the way, anyone tuning in, we'll probably go about 10 more minutes over. But this is a way for the community to manage the pandemic and to make sure that we keep our schools open. So we're all able to see the same information that the board gets and the decision-making process we have. Thank you very much for sharing that dashboard. I know there will be continuous improvement of that and feedback from the board as well. And I know that the district's been working very hard on getting it to this point, and look forward to that launch. Thank you. Is it launched, by the way?
Mr. Casa,
Sorry.
Mr. Casa, just one question for Dr. Bauer. The frequency, I guess it's on a weekly basis. What day of the week is that dashboard updated?
So we do that as frequently as we're given the data. So we get that once a week. I'm not exactly sure, Ms. Wesley, which day it comes to us, but we are immediately updating as soon as we get that from the Office of Public Health.
And it's my understanding where there's a potential for an API or the ability to get automated updates from other public sources, that is going to be tied into here as well.
That is exactly right, Mr. Casa. And they're in the process of perfecting even more, ability to get us that data even more quickly.
Thank you very much for.
Thank you, Dr. Dietrich.
I just want to add, one question is, where would that be accessible once it is published, if it is not published already?
Yes, it will be prominently displayed on our website. That's the intention. Great question, Sahana.
Is there any way, I know Canvas is a great way that secondary students at least are communicated information. So I think that might also be a helpful tool if that, again, given the various guidelines, if that's allowed. And I also do have to say, I was very happy to see that. I am a student and I'm a part of the district. So kind of seeing the transparency and also just seeing another way that parents and students can be a little bit more reassured going back into school, because that is a nervous thing given the pandemic. So I was very happy to see that. So I'm happy about that. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, and we can speak with our building principals because I believe they have the ability to push out announcements via Canvas as well. So great suggestion.
Fantastic. If we move on now to the next item on the agenda.
So approximately 2 weeks ago, I had quite a proud moment as North Penn superintendent that we had a countywide superintendent's meeting, and the Office of Public Health from Montgomery County asked our superintendents in the county to please identify a COVID-19 pandemic liaison. And they called out North Penn and said, if everyone would do it the way North Penn is doing it, this is what we would like. And I was really pleased about that. And they went on to give a little more detail in that we do have, and we're using one individual in particular to be that point of contact with the Office of Public Health, an individual who's very knowledgeable about COVID-19, about the processes that are involved in identifying and doing contact tracing and all the necessary preparedness items that need to go into any kind of a safe plan. So we are, in the process of hiring a substitute to be able to free that individual, then that this individual will be fully available to carry out the responsibilities. We do have an attachment in the board agenda that outlines the 4 significant key responsibilities. As I mentioned there, that point of contact, that compliance, just being able to field the questions from the school nurses and the administrators in the various buildings regarding the protocols and the procedures, and then being able to advise and serve as a liaison to cabinet and that whole school nursing department. So we're really excited about this. And as I said earlier, I was quite proud to be called out as the way to go about it across the entire county.
Hey, Dr. Dietrich, I couldn't have been more proud as a board member of this district than, I think, of course, it's like a Saturday and I bothered you and you're like, no, we already have that person. I mean, it's just, it was great. But that type of leadership and responsiveness in the face of crisis is going to be very helpful. My only question before opening it up to the committee for any questions, do we have the potential to expand that? Because I'm worried about bandwidth, right? With contact tracing,
Sure.
That's a lot of calls.
So we will be very agile and we will be monitoring this closely and seeing, is what we had contemplated here sufficient or we need to expand on that? And if we do, we will do that in a heartbeat.
Great. Any other questions or insights?
Just
One question for Dr. Dietrich. When do you anticipate this person being full-time supporting this effort?
As soon as we can secure the necessary substitute coverage, this individual's already functioning in a great degree in this role, but to be able to fully, assign this to her, we need to make sure we have some substitute coverage. So there's nothing being compromised right now because she still needs to do some other things. But as soon as we can get that coverage arranged, and the HR department's working diligently on doing that.
So
now
this
just push a little harder. I mean, would it be possibly in the next 2 weeks you would see that taking place? Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Is this considered a promotion or lateral move?
No, it's a lateral. It's not a promotion. It's just a matter of the responsibilities. So that's where we're seeing it. Yes.
Any other
It's
questions?
gonna look good on the resume, though.
Sure.
Sahana, any questions?
No, I'm all good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations for being called out like that and being honored for our district, Dr.
Yes.
Dietrich.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's wrap this up with safe schools data, please.
Yes, so the last item on here is simply a brief discussion on safe schools data and sharing some of our data, whether it has to do with emergency personnel reporting to our buildings, whether it has to do with school discipline and student discipline data, suspensions, expulsions, detentions, the types of infractions. We are prepared and will be prepared for whatever this board desires. We were actually, Mr. Casa and I met, I'm going to say January, and we're prepared to present in March a comparison of 2018-19 and 2019-20 up through January, a comparison. And then, as we've said previously in this meeting alone, everyone knows what happened in March. So While we don't have any discipline data right now for the 2021 school year, because we've been in a virtual environment, we do want to be transparent with the public and share our school discipline data in a sensical way. Certainly, we don't want to jeopardize school safety by sharing certain aspects or violate privacy, but we can absolutely talk about school discipline and school safety data in generic terms.
And thank you, Dr. Bauer, for
Certainly.
continuing to lead this initiative. And this is for the community, something that I'd like to see on the agenda until we advance it, because there has been so much heavy lifting by you and the administration. This wasn't, in the top 100 items. However, some of those change. This is a top priority of this committee and this board for us to be able to share, as you said, sensible data that, or reasonable data that can be shared with the public, but as well as a reminder for those who might not watch these meetings every month. What can we share, possibly an executive session on a monthly or maybe it's just quarterly basis with the entire board, so that we have better insights on some of the more sensitive data, and appreciate seeing that move forward, and would like to make sure, Mr. Durr, that this is a repeat agenda item so that we continue to advance this over the next few months. Any questions or insights from the committee?
I just want to say this was one of the most uplifting, positive meetings we've had since COVID's taken place, and it just gives me such confidence in the administration, Mr. Durr, Dr. Bauer, Dr. Dietrich, and moving us forward. And I'm really excited that we are back that you all are back in the classroom. And I was a fan of that health and safety plan when I first read it, and I think the fact that our superintendent has been identified as a leader in this, I think really speaks to all the work everyone's done. So I don't usually say thanks, because I like just doing the business, but you all rocked. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I guess I'm also wondering, I know you have a plan in place. If that uptick does occur and when we have to rebound and do something differently, I know you're already working on that, correct?
Absolutely correct. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
I just had a few questions. So this is more specific in regards to the hybrid model at the high school. I did appreciate a lot that if a student did choose to go hybrid, that they were not, their attendance was not mandatory in person, that they had that option to stay virtual if they or their parents were uncomfortable. So I do appreciate that as a student, and obviously my parents appreciate that as well. Another question I had is kind of related to what Dr. Lewis Campbell just mentioned, is cases are going up, and in the case that we have to, after opening up schools, we have to shut down again, go back to virtual out of precaution. Is there any sort of kind of direction or policies as to what that would look like?
We're really pleased that we have the ability through Canvas to be able to be more seamless if we need to go back to a full virtual type of teaching environment. We are working very closely with the Office of Public Health and their guidance, and also with Dr. Rubin and Dr. Coffin from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Policy Lab as we manage this COVID pandemic. And we had a very productive meeting with Drs. Rubin and Coffin from CHOPS Policy Lab last week. We also will have them online tomorrow evening for an hour and a half with our teachers. So we have that invitation out there to teachers across the entire county to ask whatever questions might be on their mind of Drs. Rubin and Coffin from CHOP. So I've been really pleased with Montgomery County's Office of Public Health and also the cooperation of CHOPS Policy Lab to help inform us so that we are positive we're making the right decisions as we manage this pandemic. And I'm just very grateful to them for all of their assistance.
And thank you, Dr. Dietrich. I would add, Sahana, that the board continues to work, the full board, through committees as well as work session on a dashboard on metrics that we're going to be looking at when school does return fully in session, so that the community understands, when we might be headed close to the line, so to speak, of perhaps having to go back or go back to virtual 100%. So that's something that will be unveiled as well, but we're layering in as you can tell, the administration has been doing a lot of work. Any other questions, Sahana?
No, I don't, but I just want to say I do thoroughly appreciate a lot of the actions that the board has done that seem very sensitive to what students and parents want. I myself have been very pleased actually with some of the things that have just happened and have been talked about at this meeting as a student of North Penn School District. So again, I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Sahana. I'm going to take that as our other business unless someone else needs to add anything from the committee. Then we're moving forward. I see some shaking heads, so that's a good sign. This is an opportunity for public comments. Mr. Gilmer, do we have anyone with a raised hand?
We do not yet. So if you would like to make public comment, we do have a couple of the community members in the attendee. You would raise your blue hand.
And for anyone waiting for facilities and operations, we will be
Yep.
starting shortly.
So I do not see any blue hands being raised. So that would close public comment for Safe Schools tonight.
Thank you. Of course, we can be reached by email or by phone. Please reach out to any one of the board members with questions, concerns, or insights. There is no summary of items recommended for work session. Our next meeting date is for the Safe Schools Committee is scheduled for Monday, November 30th at 6 p.m. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Adjourned. So we need to close down and
Yeah, just a reminder that we're going to, this one will close down. And so join the facilities meeting. If you're watching from the public, you'll need to register for the facilities meeting and we'll be up. And do you want to say 7:15? What time do you want to
yes,
say?
7:15 sounds great.
Okay, very good. We'll see everybody on the other side.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Dear colleagues, yeah.